So our second segment for this week is going to look at the second Obama term, which I think in foreign policy area, and frankly, a domestic policy is less successful than his first. Obama continues something of a tradition. Both the Clinton and the Bush White House had done the same thing, where there's a change in leadership of at least of the State Department. And in Obama's case, throughout the national security bureaucracy, between the first and the second term. Hillary Clinton steps down. She's preparing to run for president in 2016. Bob Gates had always made clear that he was only going to serve one term as Secretary of Defense, and so there's a kind of shakeup. Obama turns to two of his former colleagues in the Senate who had backed his sort of presidential campaigns in 2008, or at least in one case in 2012. So the new Secretary of State is John Kerry, the former senator from Massachusetts, the Democratic presidential candidate in 2004. A figure who had served in the Senate for a very, very long time. Not sure how much he had done in the Senate. It's very hard to sort of suggest that that he was in Hillary Clinton's league in terms of Secretary of State, and someone who seemed to spend a lot of his time as Secretary of State running around the world hoping he would do something to get himself the Nobel Peace Prize. He's not. I doubt very much he's going to go down as among the best secretaries of state in American history. And then as Secretary of Defense, Obama chooses a former Republican senator, critic of the Iraq War, named Chuck Hagel, a senator from Nebraska who left the Senate and then had endorsed Obama's presidential bid in 2012. Hagel's a really interesting choice. He had been on military oversight committees when he was in the Senate, but he was a lot like the Clinton, first Clinton defense secretary, Les Aspin. Remember Aspin, big player on defense issues in Congress, but then is kind of overwhelmed by the job as defense secretary. And Hagel really has a similar kind of problem. And as national security advisor, Obama promotes his first term UN ambassador, Susan Rice, to become national security advisor in the White House. This is a team which it's basically it's a stature below what he had in the first term, and I think it generally. And it's not a team that serves him particularly well. In Obama's defense, there are a series of really hard issues that emerge during his second term. The first, and I think the most important, is the collapse of central rule in Syria. So this is an ethnic and religious map of Syria, and of course, and neighboring Lebanon as well. And I think what you should get from this map is that there are a lot of different colors in Syria. It's not an ethnically or religiously unified country. Its leadership since the 1970s had been a father-son duo, the Assads, who are a member of this minority Alawite sect, which is around 10% of the population of Syria. And the Assad policies, this is the son, Bashar Assad, who took over after his father died. The Assad policies have been to rely on very strong support from the Alawite minority, very strong support from the Syrian military, and have a kind of brutally despotic regime. The Arab Spring that I talked about in the first snippets arrives in Syria as well, and it looks as if Assad is going to be the next dictator to fall. But unlike the leaders of Tunisia and of Egypt, and ultimately, even Gaddafi in Libya, who are not willing to kill their own citizens, at least in large numbers in the revolts anyway, to remain in power, Assad has no problems with this at all. He's going to hang on for dear life, and if that means triggering a civil war in Syria, he has no problem with this at all. It is known that Assad has chemical weapons, and there are concerns that if push comes to shove, if he thinks that this is the only way he can win, that he might be willing to use chemical weapons against his own people. And Obama is asked about this, and seems to indicate that if Assad uses chemical weapons, that there will be a military response. So let's take a listen.
At this point, not ordered military engagement in the situation, but the point that you made about chemical and biological weapons is critical. That's an issue that doesn't just concern Syria, it concerns our close allies in the region, including Israel. It concerns us. We cannot have a situation where chemical or biological weapons are falling into the hands of the wrong people. We have been very clear to the Assad regime, but also to other players on the ground, that a red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus. That would change my equation.
It's somehow under its state.
In a situation this this volatile, I wouldn't say that I am absolutely confident. What I'm saying is we're monitoring that situation very carefully. We have put together a range of contingency plans. We have communicated in no uncertain terms with every player in the region that that's a red line for us, and that there would be enormous consequences if we start seeing movement on the chemical weapons front, or the use of chemical weapons. That would change my calculations.
So you'll note here that the critical thing from this excerpt is that Obama twice uses the phrase red line to describe Syria's use of chemical weapons. So the argument here is, look, if Syria uses chemical weapons, there could be serious consequences. Obama had initially, unlike in Libya, had been reluctant to provide U.S. military support for the Syrian rebels. In part, it appears, and again, the documentation for this isn't really available yet, so we just have to use what's available publicly. But it appears that Obama was chastened by the aftermath of Gaddafi's death in Libya, the creation of a failed state, the death of Ambassador Stevens and the three other Americans in the Benghazi attack, and so his second term was based on a sense that the U.S. should not be using military interventions of the Libya type. But again, he says that if there's going to be chemical weapons, that's a red line that will change things. And then the Syrians use chemical weapons against their own people, and it changes nothing. Obama does not choose to intervene, and this communicates, I think, a pretty accurate message to the Middle East, that even if Obama is threatening to use force, he simply, he's not going to do it. That in the aftermath of Libya, it's not going to be something that's on his radar screen. The problem is that the situation in Syria then gets much worse. The Assad government's declaring war on its own people provides an opening for the so-called Islamic State, and ultra conservative, primarily Sunni movement that originates in Iraq in the first Obama term, but then spreads across the border into Syria. So as of early 2015, all of the areas in pink and yellow on this map are controlled by the Islamic State, ISIS. Eventually, it will be a combination of U.S. covert assistance, some Western assistance, and especially the Kurds from northern Iraq and Syria that defeat the Islamic State. But this is not this doesn't come until after the Islamic State, get just these horrific acts of violence in Syria, the taking of Western journalists hostage, the public execution of American and British journalists, and Obama, in this respect, and also triggering a wave of refugees into Europe. How much blame for this Obama deserves? Ultimately, it's Assad and the Islamic State that are causing this problem. But Obama's response seems to be weak and reactive, and his administration always seems to be one or two steps behind the times. That's in large part because Obama is increasingly focused in his second term on getting a nuclear deal with Iran, which is the chief sponsor of Assad's government in Syria. So that Obama basically has two underlying assumptions, I think, in the Iranian nuclear deal. The first is that the sanctions alone will not be able to stop Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, because the Russians and the Chinese, and even to a certain extent the French and the Germans, can't be relied on, frankly, to sustain the sanctions over a long period of time. And this is it's hardly a frivolous argument. And the second is that signing a nuclear deal might bring Iran more into the international system, to encourage more moderate forces within the Iranian government. Now, this is the first argument, I think, is a quite plausible one. The second, there's very little evidence for this, and there's nothing in the nuclear deal that applies to Iranian conduct elsewhere in the Middle East. But nonetheless, this is what the administration pushes and ultimately signs. In exchange for the deal, Iran gets a lessening of sanctions, and also the U.S. unfreezes some Iranian assets that had been frozen since dating back to the 1970s. So there's a real financial benefit for Iran to do this. Now, critics of the nuclear deal, conservatives in the U.S. And internationally, the Israelis, this is then Prime Minister Netanyahu addressing a joint session of Congress opposing the Iran deal. The argument that they make is that Iran's going to develop a nuclear weapon one way or the other. And so to give Iran these concessions, to lesser the sanctions, to give them this cash payment, is only going to make it, it's not going to stop them from developing a nuclear weapon, and it's going to make it easier for them to achieve other aspects, anti-Western aspects of their foreign policy. And this too was not a frivolous line of argument. Netanyahu's choice to involve himself in domestic politics, the idea of an Israeli prime minister addressing a joint session of Congress to publicly oppose a foreign policy move from the president, that is very unusual, and it begins the process, or it accelerates. It already been occurring, I think, by this point. It accelerates the process of more of a polarization in attitudes towards Israel, where Democrats, especially liberal Democrats and especially younger liberal Democrats, become much more sympathetic to the Palestinians in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. A big change from the previous basically 40 years, where broad swaths of the American public, conservatives, liberals, Democrats, Republicans alike, had been much more sympathetic to the Israelis. But Obama pushes forward with the nuclear deal. He does not do it critically as a treaty, because he knows he could not get 2/3 support in the Senate. And this is, I think, a change over the course of this class, where this kind of arrangement, a very significant foreign policy deal, in the Wilson years and the Roosevelt years and the immediate aftermath of World War II, this would be done by a treaty. But we've kind of moved beyond the treaty environment, and instead the choice is to handle it via an executive agreement. Obama has other struggles in international affairs during his second term. He has a testy relationship with Vladimir Putin, who had seemed to step back from affairs during Obama's first term. Putin had been Russian president. The then Russian constitution only allowed him to serve 2 terms, so he can't run for re-election in 2008. A close ally of Putin is elected. President Putin gets himself named prime minister. It's clear that Putin is really in power, but there's some hope that maybe Putin is transitioning himself out, changes this in 2012, and runs for president then, and it's clear that he is the person in authority. And Putin, during Obama's second term, becomes much more willing to challenge the Western world order, to advance the cause of Russian nationalism, I think in part to bolster his domestic standing. And he is particularly active in Ukraine, country that borders Russia to the west, which after independence had a series of pro-Russian presidents who were then kicked out in a revolution called the Orange Revolution. And in response, the Putin government sponsors various separatist movements in this eastern section of Ukraine, which has a substantial Russian population, and in 2014 actually seizes a province of Ukraine, Crimea, and annexes it to Russia. The U.S. response to this is to impose a series of sanctions on Russia, and especially on Putin and people close to Putin within the leadership of Russia. But it has very little impact, if any, on Putin's conduct. The major foreign policy accomplishment of the Obama second term is the reopening of U.S. relations with Cuba, which had been severed after the Castro Revolution in the late 1950s. This is a photo of Secretary Kerry reopening the U.S. embassy in Cuba, and the hope is that this is going to help liberalize the island by ending the boycott, allowing for tourism, for trade, bring American and Cuban cultural context together, and weakening the authoritarian communist government of the island. In the presidential campaign last year, Kerry, who was campaigning at this point on Biden's behalf in Florida, admits that this didn't work out. That yes, the U.S. did recognize Cuba, but that the Cuban government really did not advance anything with regards to human rights, and that the domestic situation in Cuba didn't really seem to improve very much. So again, it's very much a mixed bag, I think, in terms of accomplishments and setbacks during Obama's second term. It is a less talented group of figures, and I think that causes him more substantial problems. So by the end of his presidency, this is a really interesting poll. This is from Gallup. So this is a poll of Americans, asking Americans whether they believe leaders of other countries respected Obama. And you can see at the start of his administration, overwhelming a majority of Americans believed that world leaders did respect Obama. But by the time his second term progresses, it's a substantial majority by 2015 who think that Obama is not respected, and there's this image of Obama as essentially as too weak, as too passive in international affairs, and that's going to set up, I think, some of the criticisms that we see from Trump in the 2016 campaign. So that's it for our second snippet.